So I'm putting forward evidence for the likelihood that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was falsely accused of plagiarism, and that very wealthy people, after his death, changed his writing, and so they could discredit him over the years, and so they could deprive black people of the pride that they had in the man, and others to whom he was a hero. And that they did it deliberately because they wanted to foster racism in the country, not because they were seeking peace in the country. Very few people who study the civil rights movement in that time asked themselves, who were Dr. King's enemies? Who were the people he opposed? We know he opposed the Vietnam War, so who logically does that point to? It points to the richest people in the country who owned the companies that were making hardware for Vietnam. That's pretty obvious. You don't have to have a brilliance level IQ, 145 or higher, in order to see that. You see, it's got, because some people just listen to speeches of Dr. King's and they say, he didn't want racism. But obviously, we're a Christian nation. We don't want racism. Who were his opponents? And they weren't who you think they are. They weren't the average person who didn't like black people. They weren't your average person out there who has racist views. They were organized, intelligent men. They were all men to a man. The ones who had the ability to change his dissertation were men. And they designed the change of it so they could discredit him and say to people he really wasn't smart, he's not as good as white people. So in their minds, they wouldn't have to face the fact that he was as good as they and better. That's what they hated about him, and that's why Jay and his friends allowed his own FBI to sit by and watch while he was murdered by James Earl Ray from the bathroom of the boarding house across from the Lorraine Hotel, and why FBI agents were at that hotel that night, right next to Dr. King's room, as he was going to step outside, waiting for the bullet to strike. That's the truth. Because everywhere Dr. King went, they were listening to him. But the listening devices they used were able to survey the whole area and what was being said about him. So even the agents at the Lorraine Hotel room had the ability to hear James Earl Ray at the boarding house speaking about how he's going to murder Dr. King in his own room. And so that David Garrow, Garrow, he uncovered some of these truths because he studied very carefully what the FBI said and what the FBI documents said about Dr. King and what they did with respect to him. And when I arrived at Loyola University, I made it one of my first tasks to study deeply the works of David Garrow and to see exactly what the relationship was between the FBI and Dr. King, because for years I had wondered, why do they keep trying to suggest that Dr. King was a communist? And I eventually came to the conclusion that in that sense he had become a communist. You know why he became a communist? He became a communist because he realized that that's not the country that he lived in, but it's the one that would have been non-racist. So that was the one he desired. See, Christianity wasn't going to give him the society he wanted. But Marxist theory, where you organize the workers and the people so that they protest and they get a better government, that was going to get him closer. And so he acted on behalf of communist principles, because Christianity, quite frankly, tells people, render unto Caesar what's Caesar's. You know, and unto God what is God's. So there's a difference. There's an important difference. And there's an importance in our society for institutions to have credibility. Each college, there's a process of accreditation. I can't say that word very well. But they have a process of that. There's states that review them and make sure that they're capable, that they're actually hiring people that are capable of certifying that the degrees they're giving out are good. But then when we have a media that never asks the right questions and always publishes something like Papist's thesis without very many people saying the opposite, where we have a Hollywood for years. How many people need more proof than we had a Hollywood for years that would do a film on Malcolm X? They would fund Spike Lee for a film about Malcolm, who said violence. See? Because they like to keep the association between blacks and violence. So it was okay for Spike to do a film about Malcolm, but had Spike proposed doing a film about Dr. King, they wouldn't want that, because that associates blacks not with crime, and not with power seeking, and not with violence. So that one wasn't accepted. That's not acceptable to Hollywood. That's why we've never had it. Why would the Rockford Public Library here, for years I noted it, not carry copies of each book that Dr. King wrote? And why would we find that in almost every other community throughout the United States, where it's hard to find a public library that has all the books? I challenge anybody tonight at the universities, look and find out which library in the United States, how many of them there are, that carry all 7 or so of Dr. King's books that he read, rather than just one or a couple of them. How many? I'm asking. And if not very many carry the collected works of all of Dr. King's writings, why is that? Is that because they don't want them to be disseminated? Because they don't want people to have access to them? Because they've burned people's libraries and they want them, when they come there to find the books, they want them to find only fragmentary books and missing books? Because they want to keep the impression of missing books in their mind? I think so. But this is a problem, see? If I were the President of the United States, I would say, I don't take this. I don't need to take this. I have power, and I can use it. But that doesn't happen very frequently because conformism, see? Dr. King was not a conformist. He was not someone who said, oh, I'm going to do what the white man tells me to do. That's what made him authentic, see? Well, ever since he was young and he was in a car one day and he got pulled over, his dad got pulled over by a cop, and his father was a priest, a preacher, a pastor, and ever since that cop kind of like pointed his finger at Dr. King's dad and said, boy, I'm going to tell you. And Dr. King said, that ain't going to be how I'm going to be. And that ain't how people should be. So that's why Dr. King said, we're not yet what we ought to be, but we're making progress because we realize that. You see, everybody realizes, I realize, that I don't have the great capacities that he had, and that I'm limited in the power that I have in the country that I live in, because it is this way. If people want a further proof of the racism in Rockford, they can, and as I'm going to in the future, talk to Ed Wells and ask Ed Wells this question. Ed Wells, if there's not deeper problems than the ones that you uncovered in the school system, why has the Rockford Public Library never carried all the books of Dr. King? And the reason is obvious. Because disseminating the ideas of Dr. King causes people to associate black people with goodness and with nonviolence. But from the beginning of the country, many racists of the country have always wanted black to be associated with violence, as in Moby Dick. A lot of the negative connotations of the black is a good thing. Black's, like Malcolm said, black is good, black is beautiful. But yet, the language would make it so it's not. And Malcolm said, I don't want a country like that. I want a country that makes black beautiful, that makes all people beautiful. Dr. King added. He said, wait a minute, Malcolm, it's not just black people, it's people. See? The unity of people. That's what made Dr. King say, in the future it won't be the day of the black man or the white man, but it'll be the day of man as man. He was calling himself back to Marx there, where Marx says, man's species being, his true nature, to be a unity, and a spiritual unity with all brothers and sisters of the human race, was to be the goal. And I'm afraid that that vision I had in that poem will come true, but after that time, it'll be the day of man as man, and woman as woman, and man and woman. But it's going to require that kind of horror because of how much power those who didn't want that have come to have, and have come to now want to use deviously, maliciously, and murderously.